1984, Torvill and Dean win gold at the Winter Olympics. The miners' strike begins. Nice music, this, isn't it? I typed it off the radio. And the half-p coin is withdrawn from circulation. Meanwhile, at the Trotter's flat in Peckham, it's a typical scene with Del and Rodney gently teasing poor old Grandad.
I were in the RAF, I flew in Wellington.
Why didn't you just wear flying boots like everyone else?
These are... Well, you might think you've seen every episode of Only Fools, but I bet you haven't seen that one. In fact, that episode was made as a promotional film for schools funded by a petroleum company to encourage children into the oil and gas industry. And it's not the only lost episode of Only Fools, more on that later. But we can reveal that it does have a very poignant importance. Licensed to Drill wasn't shown on TV at the time, but if it had been, it would have been the viewer's last glimpse of Leonard Pierce playing Grandad. The second episode of Series 4 opened with some moving and emotional scenes as Del and Rodney attend Grandad's funeral.
We'll leave the car.
It was a terrible occasion. You know, this is Leonard Pierce who died, not just a character in a show. We were saying goodbye to a really nice gentleman and a great character.
Leonard Pierce, he'd always had health problems. He'd suffered from hypertension, and later on he also became somewhat reliant on alcohol as well. He just became more frail because of his health as time went on. Sometimes he'd have someone help him to come to work. It was a tough life for him in the final couple of years or so.
Pierce suffered a fatal heart attack aged 69, a couple of days after filming some location scenes for Series 4.
This was late 1984, so it was decided to kind of shelve everything until the new year.
The death of Leonard wasn't just a personal sadness for John Sullivan and the rest of the team. It presented a very practical problem. Scripts had already been written and some filming had even been completed, but now one of the main characters was gone.
And then the question had to be, how do they deal with this? And that, again, really shows you the distinctiveness of the show and also the distinctiveness of John Sullivan, that he really wanted Only Fools and Horses to be something with more depth in it than conventional sitcoms. Whereas the old routine might have been you either write the character out or you recast it. He wanted the character to die and the next level and made it very special in terms of the acting and the power of the script.
In between Christmas and New Year, it was decided that the series would continue, but John Sullivan wouldn't. He didn't entertain the thought of recasting Leonard Pierce's character. So we had to cleverly write a new introduction episode, and like all funerals, family come out the woodwork, and it was a great opportunity to introduce another character, a brother of Granddad, Uncle Albert.
Buster Merrifield shuffled onto our screens as Uncle Albert with his Father Christmas beard, an endless supply of war stories. Merrifield had inserted himself just as cunningly into the series. Having only recently taken up acting, when he heard that Leonard Pierce had died, he wrote a letter to the BBC asking to be cast as a replacement character.
The guy was a bank manager. It was his first professional job. You know, he'd sent in a photograph, and John just went, that's Uncle Albert, you know.
It was a move of which Del Boy would have been proud. Lovely jubbly. But casting the other characters for this funny, sad, brash, touching sitcom hadn't been quite so easy.
When it came to Del Boy, they did go through quite a number. They looked at Jim Broadbent, for example, who didn't want it because he wanted to stay on the stage. And they looked at N. Rytel, who was very famous for voiceovers. And they went through a few others until David Jason became an option.
Well, Ray Butt caught a repeat of Open All Hours, and he saw Granville, this character played by David Jason.
And he saw something in that character, this little man who was quite vulnerable, but also quite prickly when it suited him.
And Ray Butt was instantly taken and thought, that's our Del Boy. And he phoned up John Sullivan and said, I found him. He's got to be David Jason.
But would this David Jason have the star power for a leading role?
David Jason was really an interesting character because for a good decade or so, if you looked at entertainment articles in the newspapers, at regular intervals they were saying, isn't it time for this man to become a star?
David Jason had played opposite Ronnie Barker in both Open All Hours and Porridge. And behind the scenes at the BBC, there was a fear that casting Jason in a starring role would offend Ronnie Barker, who at the time was one of their biggest stars. And John Sullivan wasn't sure that Jason was their man either.
John Sullivan, to begin with, wasn't overly convinced. He had to take a little bit of convincing because David Jason was really famous at that point for playing largely quite slapsticky type parts, I suppose.
Even David Jason wasn't quite sure what was going on with the casting.
David originally, when he got the script, thought, well, they want me to play Granddad, which was possibly logical because he was quite adept at playing old men.
The wranglings about casting David Jason were made more complicated because Nicholas Lyndhurst was already in place as Rodney.
Nicholas Lyndhurst, great actor because he's quite posh, really. I remember he was like in loads of children's film foundation films, like he was in The Prince and the Pauper, and he played both parts.
He'd been in a number of things, and obviously it caught many people's eyes in Butterflies as a sitcom, playing a fairly kind of middle-class figure. But I think enough of the team had seen him in other things to realise that he could bring this sense of authenticity and vulnerability to the role of Rodney.
Lyndhurst may have been perfect for the gawky, awkward Rodney, but Head of Light Entertainment Jimmy Gilbert was adamant that the two trotters should look like brothers.
When it came to Boy and Rodney in particular, I think Jimmy Gilbert thought because they were brothers, they ought to be quite alike. And so eventually when David Jason and Nicholas Lyndhurst were cast, he was quite resistant to that at the beginning, I think, because he said they don't look like each other. And someone had to say, well, that's partly the point.
The iconic part of Marlene was originally written into just one episode until Sue Holderness impressed the team with her first scene.
It was a tiny little scene in an episode called Sleeping Dogs Lie. It was in series 4, and all I knew about this character Marlene was that occasionally people would say, "Oh, do you remember Marlene?" And the reply was always, "All the boys remember Marlene." So, I gathered she was obviously a bit of a girl. And at the end of it, I absolutely just thought, what a wonderful day out. Pity it's only one day, but hey-ho. And it was a couple of weeks later that John Sullivan rang and said, "We'd like Marlene to come back." And he said, "Then this is a surprise because we weren't going to have Marlene back. Thank you. Thank you."
Marlene's dress sense was about as subtle as a leopard print brick, and the secret behind that involved some very interesting shopping trips.
Well, when I'd got the call that I was going to be in Only Fools and Horses, I met up with the makeup and the wardrobe department in Dickinson Jones to choose Marlene's look. And everything we tried on, the gaudier and the worse it was, the assistants in the store would say, "Oh, madam looks so lovely in that." They didn't really get it. But we did have some glorious times, and leopard print did become a very strong feature of Marlene's wardrobe. I mean, why not? Don't we all love a bit of leopard print?
As the series got bigger, so did the cast, and eventually Del and Rodney had their own families. But one casting decision could have made things very different for Rodney.
Well, many people were considered for the role of Cassandra, most notably Liz Hurley. She auditioned for the role, and it was felt that perhaps she was probably a little bit too glamorous for our, how can I say it diplomatically, our lanky trotter brother.
With Tessa Peake-Jones and Gwyneth Strong joining the cast, things felt a bit different at Nelson Mandela House. And if they looked a bit different too, well, we can let you in on a little secret about that.
You don't really notice unless you look for it, but with this expanded cast, the set's a lot bigger. They literally just added like 1.5 meters where the window was, and it's like an extra section A.
This once unloved sitcom ended up making superstars of the cast, including Jim Broadbent, who hadn't wanted the role of Del Boy, but did bring a menacing snideness to the role of bent copper Inspector Roy Slater.
Chief Inspector.
Sorry, I didn't know you'd been promoted.
Do you fancy a cup of tea, Del?
Actually, Roy, we're in a bit of a hurry, if you don't mind.
I don't think you heard the question, Del. I said, do you fancy a cup of tea?
Well, now you come to mention it, I'm a bit parched.
As soon as you mention the name Slater, or Slater, if you prefer, immediately we think of Only Fools and Horses, don't we? And immediately we think of Jim Broadbent. He was Slater. It was what a role.
And being famous for being in the nation's top sitcom is a given, but Boise actor John Challis was stunned to discover just how popular he was. It turns out Only Fools is a massive hit in the Balkans, and after filming a documentary about it in Belgrade, Boise, well, John Challis, was actually made an honorary citizen of Serbia. The cast of Only Fools may have been elevated to godlike status, but there was one occasion when the production was a teeny bit careless with some of them.
For Miami Twice, it was decided to really take the Trotters transatlantic to this wonderful kind of big road film, with the first part being filmed as like a standard 50-minute episode in London, and the second half would be the Trotter brothers' adventures in Miami.
The most exciting read-through, I think, probably was when we had Miami twice, because at that read-through we discovered the only people going to Miami were Del, Rodney, Boycie and Marlene. You can imagine how pleased the rest of the cast were when they discovered that.
A big-budget foreign shoot? Oh, it all sounds very glam. What could possibly go wrong?
Filming in the Everglades was quite frightening. Because we were short of time, everybody was pushed for time. There's one bit where there's an alligator that is walking behind Del and Rodney, who are sitting on a log. And they had a big burly chap called Sean, who was there to try and keep control of this alligator. The idea was that the alligator would walk up behind Del and Rodney, they'd run off, and the alligator would run towards them, and there was a bowl of food here. So the alligator was left off its leash.
Very slowly walk away.
I, in the meantime, was filming this with my video camera, and I didn't notice that these boys had gone, and I lost the alligator in my camera, and it was about 2 feet from me. And Sean, the chap who was supposed to be in charge, had leapt on its tail, grabbed its jaws shut, and was wrapping this thing around it. With me, I nearly died of fear. Nearly died. In fact, I nearly died. Not only of fear, I could have been eaten by an alligator.
Coming up, the secret behind why we love these characters.
Del boy, terrible man. He's flogging you what? What? Fire damage wocks? Rain damaged umbrellas? What's all that about?
And the episode that vanished for 20 years.
There were very few episodes that we weren't entirely happy with. One of the episodes was Royal Flush.